Derek Cole had been called cheap so many times throughout his life that the word had stopped stinging years ago. His mother called him tight-fisted. His father called him calculating, usually with a small shake of the head, as though disappointment were a habit he'd practiced long enough to perfect. His younger brother, Brian, had a nickname he used more affectionately, though it still carried an edge: Scrooge, after the famous miser from the old Christmas story, a name that had followed Derek since childhood and had somehow never faded. He had moved from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, to Seattle, Washington, nearly 8 years earlier, chasing a job offer at a mid-sized technology company that had, at the time, seemed like an enormous risk. He'd arrived with 2 suitcases, a laptop that was already 3 years outdated, and just enough savings to cover 2 months of rent if nothing went wrong. Something about that early scarcity had rewired the way he thought about money permanently, though he rarely explained this to anyone, including himself, in any detail worth repeating at family dinners. He remembered vividly the winter he turned 11, when his father's small hardware store had nearly closed after a slow holiday season left them behind on the mortgage for 2 consecutive months. He remembered his mother sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills, sorting them into piles by urgency, her face drawn tight with a worry she tried, unsuccessfully, to hide from her sons. Nobody had explicitly explained the situation to Derek at the time, but children absorb more than adults realize, and he had understood, in the vague, unsettling way children understand serious things, that money was not a guarantee, that comfort could disappear quickly if nobody paid careful attention to protecting it. That winter had passed, the store had recovered, and life had gradually returned to normal. But something in Derek had never fully relaxed again, some quiet vigilance that had simply become a permanent part of how he moved through the world. Derek's approach to spending followed a private, deliberate logic that made perfect sense to him and almost no sense to anyone else. He avoided what he privately called consumable spending entirely, refusing to pay for elaborate restaurant meals, name-brand clothing, or vacations at expensive resorts, since those experiences, however pleasant, disappeared the moment they were finished, leaving nothing behind except a receipt and a fading memory. Instead, he channeled his money toward what he considered durable value, a laptop capable of running his side projects without lag, a reliable and increasingly impressive car he had saved 3 years to afford outright, and a growing investment account he checked every morning before his first cup of coffee, always brewed at home, never purchased from the coffee shop 2 blocks from his apartment. His current apartment, however, remained deliberately modest, a 1-bedroom unit in a decent but unremarkable building, because Derek was saving towards something larger, a house, paid for as much as possible in cash, spacious enough that his entire extended family could visit comfortably whenever they chose. He hadn't mentioned this particular goal to anyone back home, mostly because explaining it required unpacking years of financial reasoning that he suspected his family had neither the patience nor the interest to sit through. What his family saw instead was simpler and considerably less flattering. They saw a son and brother who wore the same 3 shirts in every video call, who ordered the cheapest item on any restaurant menu when dining out, who never sent so much as a birthday card containing anything more than a short, practical message. When his niece and nephew, Tyler and Ava, sent him hand-drawn pictures for his birthday one year, he thanked them warmly over video call, but never once shipped a gift back in return, reasoning privately that children their age wouldn't remember a distant uncle's present anyway, not the way they'd remember an actual visit. The tension reached its clearest point that spring, when Brian, his wife Sophie, and their 2 children flew out to Seattle for a 10-day visit. The first time the whole family had made the trip together, Derek had genuinely looked forward to it, clearing his work calendar as much as his job allowed, mapping out free hiking trails and public parks he thought the kids would enjoy, planning museum visits that required no admission fee on the first Thursday of the month. He had even, quietly and without mentioning it to anyone, spent an entire Saturday afternoon researching the best tide pool locations within driving distance, cross-referencing tide charts to make sure they'd arrive at exactly the right hour to see the largest variety of sea creatures exposed along the rocky shoreline. It was the kind of careful, invisible effort Derek put into most things that mattered to him, effort that rarely announced itself the way an expensive gift or an elaborate dinner might, and that, as a result, often went entirely unnoticed by the people it was meant for. What he hadn't planned were expensive dinners downtown, VIP tickets to the aquarium, or the kind of extravagant, photograph-worthy outings that Brian, without quite saying so directly, seemed to expect from a brother who, according to family rumor, had been quietly accumulating a small fortune out west. "You could at least take us somewhere nice," Brian said on the 3rd evening, after Derek suggested an inexpensive but well-reviewed noodle shop near his apartment instead of the steakhouse Sophie had mentioned earlier that day. "It's not like you can't afford it, Derek. Everybody knows you're doing well out here." "I can afford it," Derek said evenly, keeping his tone light despite the familiar tightness building in his chest. "I just don't see the point in spending $200 on a dinner that's gone in an hour. The noodle place is genuinely great, I promise." Brian sighed, the particular sigh he'd been using on Derek since they were teenagers sharing a bedroom. "It's not really about the food, man. It's about making an effort. We flew all the way out here. If you are enjoying this story so far, please like this video and subscribe for more emotional English stories. Now, let's continue." Derek didn't have a satisfying response to that, not one he felt like offering in the moment, so he simply let the comment settle uncomfortably between them and changed the subject to their hiking plans for the following morning. Their father called 2 nights later, his voice carrying the particular disappointment he reserved for conversations he considered important. "Your brother came all this way, Derek, with the kids and everything, and you couldn't take him somewhere nice even once? Buy your nephew and niece something they'll actually remember?" "Dad, I took them hiking. I took them to 2 different parks. Tyler said the tide pools were the best part of the whole trip." "That's not the same as showing you care," his father said. "You know what people back home say about you? They say you've gotten selfish, out there by yourself, worrying only about your own bank account. Your mother worries about this, Derek. She wonders what happened to you." "Nothing happened to me, Dad. I'm the same person I've always been. I just don't think spending money loudly is the same thing as caring about someone." "Nobody's asking you to spend loudly," his father said, his voice rising slightly with frustration. "We're asking you to spend at all. Do you know how it looks, to the rest of the family, when your brother mentions you make good money out there, and then he comes home talking about instant noodles and free hiking trails? People talk, Derek. They ask your mother questions she doesn't know how to answer." "I'm sorry Mom has to deal with that," Derek said carefully. "But I'm not going to change how I live just so people back home have a better story to repeat at dinner parties." His father exhaled heavily on the other end of the line. "You've always been stubborn like this, even as a boy. I just hope, one day, you understand that family isn't a spreadsheet, Derek. It doesn't work by the same rules as your investment accounts." The call ended shortly after, neither of them fully satisfied, both retreating to their respective silences the way they usually did after conversations like this one. The accusation landed harder than Derek expected, sitting alone in his apartment that night after Brian's family had gone to bed in the guest room down the hall. He stared at the ceiling for a long time, turning the conversation over in his mind, wondering, not for the first time, whether his family's version of him had somehow become more real, in their eyes, than the actual reasoning behind everything he did. He thought about explaining it properly, laying out the whole picture, the modest apartment, the growing savings account, the specific number he'd been steadily working toward for the house he hoped, eventually, could become a real gathering place for the entire family, rather than a symbol of his own success. But something held him back each time he considered it, a stubborn, private instinct that resisted turning his financial discipline into a performance meant to win back his family's approval. If he had to explain himself to be understood, some part of him reasoned, then perhaps the understanding wouldn't mean very much anyway. Brian's family flew home a week later, the visit ending on a note of polite warmth that didn't quite erase the tension underneath it. Derek returned to his usual routine, the noodle shop, the home-brewed coffee, the quiet discipline of watching his savings account grow by careful, unglamorous increments each month. Then, in early autumn, his phone rang at 2 a.m, waking him from a deep sleep. It was his mother, her voice unsteady in a way he had rarely heard before. "It's your father," she said. "He collapsed at the hardware store this afternoon. They think it's his heart. We're at the hospital now. They're saying he needs surgery, Derek, soon, and it's complicated. The insurance situation is complicated." Derek was on his feet immediately, pulling on clothes with one hand while holding the phone with the other. "What do you mean, complicated? What's going on with the insurance?" His mother's voice cracked slightly. "His policy lapsed a few months ago. He was supposed to renew it, but with everything going on at the store, he forgot. Or he put it off. I don't know. The hospital is saying the surgery alone could cost close to $80,000, and that's before anything else. Brian's trying to figure out what we can pull together, but between his mortgage and the kids' school costs, there's just not much room." Derek felt something settle inside him, quiet and certain, the exact opposite of panic. "Don't worry about the money tonight. Focus on Dad. I'm booking a flight right now, and I'll handle the hospital directly once I land. Tell them not to delay the surgery for any financial paperwork. I'll take care of it." There was a pause on the line. "Derek, that's a lot of money. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," he said simply. "Just be there for him." "I'll be there by morning." By the time Derek landed in Columbus 7 hours later, he had already wired a substantial deposit directly to the hospital's billing department, enough to authorize the surgery without further delay, using funds from the very account his family had spent years quietly criticizing him for building. He arrived at the hospital still wearing yesterday's clothes, exhausted from the overnight flight, to find his mother sitting alone in the waiting room, her eyes red-rimmed but calmer now that the immediate crisis had passed. The waiting room smelled faintly of stale coffee and antiseptic fluorescent lights humming overhead in a way that made everything feel slightly too bright for the hour. Derek sat down beside his mother, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the exhaustion of the past several hours settling heavily over both of them. He noticed her hands were still trembling slightly, though whether from fear or relief, he couldn't quite tell. "The doctor said the surgery went well," she told him, standing to hug him tightly. "They said if it had been delayed even another few hours, waiting on insurance approval, it could have been much worse." Derek held on to his mother a beat longer than usual, feeling something in his chest loosen slightly now that the worst possibility had passed. "Can I see him?" "Not yet. He's still in recovery. The nurse said maybe another hour." His mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, then looked at him properly for the first time since he'd arrived. "Derek, when the billing office called to confirm everything was covered, I honestly thought there had been some kind of mix-up. I didn't know what to think." "There wasn't a mix-up," Derek said quietly. "I just did what needed doing." Brian arrived 20 minutes later, having driven straight from dropping the kids at school, his face still tight with worry, until he saw Derek standing there. "You already handled it?" "The billing office called me an hour ago, saying the deposit was covered. I thought there was some kind of mistake." "No mistake," Derek said quietly. "I told Mom I'd take care of it, so I did." Brian stood there for a long moment, processing something Derek could see shifting slowly across his face. "Derek, that has to be tens of thousands of dollars. You just wired that without even discussing it with anyone first?" "There wasn't really time to discuss it," Derek said. "Dad needed surgery. I had the money. It wasn't a complicated decision." Their father, once he was stable enough to have visitors, listened quietly as Brian explained what Derek had done, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to shame as the full picture settled in. "I called you selfish," he said finally, his voice weak but clear. "In front of your brother, more than once, I told your mother I worried about what you'd become out there." "You weren't entirely wrong to wonder," Derek said, pulling a chair closer to the hospital bed. "I probably could have explained things better, instead of just letting everyone assume the worst. I wasn't saving that money to show off, or even really for myself. I've just always believed that real security, the kind that actually protects the people you love when something goes wrong, matters more than looking generous at a dinner table. I didn't think anyone would understand that, so I stopped trying to explain it." His father was quiet for a moment, staring up at the ceiling tiles as though gathering the strength for what came next. "Your mother and we grew up believing that showing love meant showing up with something in your hands. A gift, a good meal, something people could see and remember. Nobody ever taught us that saving quietly, in the background, without any of that, could be its own kind of showing up. I think that's why it never registered with me as care. It just looked like distance." "I understand that now, in a way I didn't before," Derek said. "I think I assumed everyone would eventually see the reasoning on their own, without me needing to say it out loud. That wasn't fair to any of you." His father reached over and gripped his hand, his eyes wet. "I understand it now. I'm sorry it took something like this for me to see it clearly." In the weeks that followed, as his father recovered steadily at home, Derek found himself having a different kind of conversation with his family, one built less around old assumptions and more around honest explanation. He told Brian, during a long phone call one evening, about the house he'd been saving toward, the specific number he was working past, the hope that it might one day become the exact kind of gathering place their family had never quite had growing up. You could have just told us that from the start, Brian said, not unkindly. It would have saved a lot of arguments. Maybe, Derek admitted. I think I wanted people to trust my character without needing a full explanation attached to it. That wasn't fair to any of you, honestly. Trust doesn't really work that way. It needs something to actually stand on. I get it now, Brian said. Honestly, I probably owe you an apology too. I gave you a hard time about the restaurant thing, and the whole time you were sitting on enough to cover Dad's entire surgery without blinking. Makes me feel a little ridiculous, complaining about noodles. You weren't wrong to want more effort from me, though, Derek said. I could have explained things instead of just letting everyone assume the worst version of the story. That part's on me. Let's just call it even, Brian said, a small laugh creeping into his voice for the first time since the crisis began. Besides, Sophie says the noodle place was actually really good, once she got over being annoyed about the steakhouse. Tell her I'll take her back next time, Derek said, smiling despite himself. Best in the neighborhood, I promise. For what it's worth, Brian said, the tide pools really were the best part of the trip. For the kids, at least. Ava still talks about it. Derek laughed, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been tight for longer than he had fully realized. Tell her I found a better spot for next time. Bigger tide pools? Fewer crowds? Bring Dad along, Brian said. Once he's cleared to travel again. I will, Derek said. And for the first time in years, the promise didn't feel like an obligation he was reluctantly accepting, but something he actually wanted, plainly and simply, without needing to calculate its value first. Months later, standing in the driveway of a modest but solid house he'd finally closed on that winter, larger than his old apartment by several times over, with a spare room already set up for whenever his parents wanted to visit, Derek thought about how differently this same moment might have played out if the crisis with his father had never forced the truth into the open. He might still be quietly saving, quietly misunderstood, carrying the weight of his family's disappointment without ever fully knowing whether it was worth correcting. He understood now that discipline without communication could look, from the outside, exactly like indifference, no matter how much genuine care sat underneath it. The lesson hadn't been to spend more freely, exactly, or to abandon the habits that had gotten him this far. It had been simpler than that, and harder in its own way. That the people who loved him deserved to understand the reasoning behind his choices, not just witness the results of them from a careful, unexplained distance. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.